My name's Tristan Kirk. I am the courts correspondent for the London Standard. Well, in London there are tragically many young people who are killed as a result of knife crime. I cover murder cases, attempted murders, serious stabbings at the Old Bailey and the other Crown courts around London. And one of the things that is thematic in a lot of those cases is that there are young people involved, not just as victims, but also as perpetrators. And in their past, before they've carried out a very, very serious stabbing, one that potentially has ended up as a murder, they've been through the youth court system, where they've been accused, convicted and sentenced of carrying knives. At that point, not having used that knife, potentially picked it up for protection, to fit in with their peers, or for some other reason. And I wanted to explore why it was that those young people were picking up knives, what they were doing before they become convicted criminals, and how the courts, specifically the youth courts, go about trying to persuade them to put down the knives, to not go down the path of crime, and potentially to avoid becoming one of those young children who are either killed as a result of knife crime or are the perpetrators themselves and end up spending many of their best years in prison. As the courts correspondent for the newspaper, I spend, as you might imagine, a lot of my time in court and a good proportion of that time in the magistrates' court, the adult courts. And that's where anybody over the age of 18 accused of a crime will come in, sit in the dock, and their case will be dealt with. That's a situation that I think we can all appreciate, know about, and it's open to the public, so anybody can wander in and can watch the adult court taking place. The youth courts are a very different affair. First of all, members of the public, unless they are specifically involved in the case, are simply not allowed in the room. This is a measure that's put in place across all of youth courts in England and Wales to protect the children involved, to make the proceedings less daunting and potentially to disrupt the proceedings if the children are too traumatised and distressed by what's going on and it happening in public. But as an accredited member of the media, I am one of the people who is allowed to go in and watch proceedings and then to report on what I see with strict restrictions in place, such as not being able to identify the young people involved. In London's youth courts, they are very used to hearing about knife crime, robberies, thefts and street violence. Unfortunately, those are mainstays of our youth courts and things that teenagers around the capital are brought into the dock, into the court and accused of doing. And so carrying knives is one of those offences that is incredibly prevalent in the youth court. And when you sit in those hearings, you get to hear about why the youth chose to carry a knife, what pressures they were under, whether they used it or not. Hopefully not, but sometimes, in fact, quite frequently, knives are used or intimated in robberies, particularly mobile phone robberies. It's another common type of case. When you sit in the hearings, you hear directly from the young person, the teenager who's accused, who may well have admitted possession of a knife, and what's the story behind why they did it. You get to hear whether they're sorry, ashamed, apologetic to their parents, whether they understand what they did was wrong, and crucially whether they recognise that carrying a knife is essentially a gateway towards much more serious events that could impact on their lives. They could end up stabbing somebody, whether they went out that day thinking they were going to or not. They could end up getting stabbed themselves. They could end up with a serious criminal conviction and something that hangs over their entire adult life. In the youth courts, the setup is slightly different to the adult courts in that the parents of the defendants sit alongside them. The children who are accused are referred to by their first name. It's stripped back the sort of the legal dressing of a court hearing to make it as less intimidating for the child defendant and more amenable to doing good justice. I've sat in quite a number of youth court hearings over the last few months, and a teenager, it tends to be a teenage boy who has been caught carrying a knife, frequently puts forward that they did it for protection. It's not a defence to carry a knife for protection, but it is put forward as mitigation, as a reason, and to give the court a better understanding of why they did what they did. I think we can all recognise that in London there is a problem with knife crime, with violence, with gang affiliation, with robberies and thefts, particularly mobile phone thefts. And unfortunately there are some teenagers who feel, wrongly of course, but nonetheless feel it, that they must carry a weapon in order to protect themselves or to show that they are something, perhaps not somebody who can be victimised. The courts have a battle on their hands because they have to tell these young people that they are putting themselves in danger by doing that. Not only are they breaking the law, but there are many, many occasions where the knife that somebody says that they are carrying just for protection ends up getting used, and so things have escalated beyond what they anticipated in the first place. I heard stories of one teenage boy who was walking his girlfriend home one night. They'd spent the evening together. He was walking her back to her house and they were stopped by the police, and he had a machete tucked into his trousers. It seems obvious when you say it out loud like that there was a pretty bad decision was made, and that's what the courts do, is they spell it out to the young person that obviously this is the wrong way to go about things, but then they try and understand why they did that in the first place. I mean, this was a boy who had a tragic story in his back history, and he made that decision out of fear, out of his own protection, in inverted commas, but obviously not the right choice. Well, magistrates, when you see them in the adult courts, are there to deliver justice. They tell people that they've done wrong, and they pass sentence. And there does tend to be an element of it being almost formulaic, a role of dispensing the justice in the way that the court proceedings warrant. In the youth courts, it's a very different role that you see them performing. Of course they are dispensing justice and deciding on the punishments, but I think more than that, they are trying to persuade the young defendants from a position of authority that they've gone down the wrong path, and hopefully they will change. They won't do it again. They won't end up back before the courts. And so magistrates can almost feel like a teacher figure, telling a student off. I mean, let's not forget these are teenage boys, so that's a kind of dynamic that they would be used to, is a teenager, somebody looking to somebody in authority like a teacher or a head teacher, telling them off and potentially steering them out of trouble. Magistrates can utilise some of the other tools available to them, like the fact that the defendants, the young defendants' parents, are more often than not in the room, sat next to them. And so you hear magistrates presenting to these young people exactly what crime that they've committed, and really playing quite heavily on the shame and the embarrassment that they've brought on their parents. I observed one hearing which was a boy who'd taken the train back to London, and when he'd got off at King's Cross, he'd been stopped by a police officer and had a knife on him. His mother had to arrange childcare for her other children, emergency childcare, and rush down to court because her son had been locked up for the night, and she had to be there, and her life had been turned upside down by this moment. And you heard the magistrate pointing out to this shamefaced boy, look what you've done, look what you've put your mother through. She's mortified. This is a terrifying, humiliating experience for her, and that's one of the key tools that the magistrates can use, I think, to try to almost shame the boys into not doing it again. And when somebody has been caught with a knife, It's pretty open and shut, really. The police have seized a weapon, they plead guilty. There's unlikely to be much of a dispute around that. And you see teenage boys who are embarrassed, who apologise, pretty forthright. I'm really sorry. They're not necessarily the most eloquent people. They're only 14, 15, 16, 17, and so they are, sometimes a very new experience to them. But they are encouraged through it by the legal team that they have, by their parents sitting nearby, and by the magistrates to apologise and to speak a little bit about what it is that they did and why it's not the right thing. And so you do get a lot of apologies and embarrassment, especially when their mums are sat across the room or sat next to them, because they know that more than anything else that they've let down somebody who more often than not is very close to them and somebody that they love and respect and don't want to let down. In youth justice, there's a range of potential punishments / rehabilitation that can be offered to somebody. A defendant, once they've pleaded guilty or been convicted, they could get a fine, which is obviously at the bottom end of the offending. At the top end is the potential for what's called a detention and training order, which is essentially youth prison, but with aspects of it to train them, to rehabilitate them. And in the middle, which is the large portion of the sentencings, are either referral orders or youth rehabilitation orders. Now, referral orders is the ones that I've seen most commonly given out, and I think courts rely on those quite heavily because that is basically saying to a young person, here's your chance. You've done something wrong, you've been caught carrying a knife on the streets of London. This could have been far worse for you if a fight had broken out and you'd ended up stabbing somebody. However, this is your chance to turn things around, essentially. So what you will be told to do as the teenage offender is to report to an independent panel, youth workers and social workers, people who are trying to help you to do better in the future. They will sign a contract which basically sets out everything that offender has to do for the next 6, 8 months or so. And then that's the way that the sentencing is carried out. So there's no locking somebody up. It's very much geared at trying to help them to appreciate what they did wrong, learn new skills, train, learn about knife crime, learn about the way that people can be impacted through the carrying and use of knives in a way that I think sometimes teenage boys, maybe through immaturity, haven't yet realised. And so the sentencing that's done in the youth court is very much geared towards trying to avoid locking people up, because they are young people and they're at an impressionable age, and you want, if at all possible, to help them to not offend again. As I heard one magistrate say, we don't want to see you again unless you're coming back here as a lawyer or as a magistrate or as a judge. And that sort of encapsulated the ambition of the court. It might sound trite and it might sound slightly ridiculous in a lot of cases, but that is essentially the goal. The ideal for any court, especially the youth court, is to send away an offender with help, with assistance, and to never see them again. When you sit in the youth court, you do come to appreciate that it's a system which is based largely on hope, with experience and with tools to try to make that hope and ambition become a reality. You hope that the teenage boys will learn the error of their ways and never trouble the courts again. But obviously, that's not necessarily always the case. The recent case involving the murder of Kellyanne Bokassa on a bus in Woolwich is really, really tragic. A 14-year-old boy whose life was taken in really brutal circumstances. And what we now know is that the two teenagers who did it had each been before the youth courts in the relatively recent past. One had been convicted of a mobile phone robbery and involving a knife, and the other one of simple possession of a knife, and they were both given referral orders, sent off, given the contract and agreement to do various things to try and rehabilitate. It clearly hadn't worked, and at least one of them was involved in drugs and in gang association. Another of them had breached the referral order before going on to murder Kellyanne. So these tools are used by the courts because they hope they will work, but there is an acknowledgement that it won't always be the case, as regrettable as that is.